Hello. Did you know that the drone industry is already over 10 years old? It feels like a really new industry, but at the same time, a decade has at least gone past. And with that decade, we find ourselves in the situation where sometimes there are myths that are shared when it comes to drone mapping. So in this particular video, we're going to bust 5 of those drone mapping myths and hopefully give you some more information on how you can make great maps and models. Let's have a look. Hey everyone, I'm Varun from Hammer Missions, and in this particular video, we're going to go through what are some of the 5 most common drone mapping myths and what you can do about them. Let's go. So the first myth that we typically see is, I need GCPs for my measurements project. Right, so GCPs or ground control points are really important when it comes to accuracy of your drone data sets. However, they're not the most important thing when it comes to measurements, because it all depends what the end goal of the project is. If you're really trying to make sure that you can measure a particular roof or facade or a stockpile, what you really want is that the model is internally consistent. And what I mean by that is that the model is essentially accurate in terms of relative accuracy, in terms of how all the different structures, all the different things in the map or model align with each other. And so GCPs are actually a method that really help with absolute accuracy of your data set as opposed to relative accuracy. And what I mean by that is that GCPs or ground control points, they help align your map and model to the real world and make sure that they are geo-referenced properly, your maps and models. So you could have a data set that actually did not use GCPs, but is actually quite accurate in terms of the measurements that come out of it. So there is this sort of big myth that you need GCPs for a project that has measurements. And I think the confusion really stems from the idea that both GCPs and measurements require accuracy, but they require different type of accuracy. GCPs is more about absolute accuracy, and measurements generally rely on the relative accuracy of your project, which actually depends more about GSD. And so if you want to learn more about GSD, we made a different video on GSD and ground sampling distance, so feel free to check that out. Right, moving on to myth number 2. So I need a high megapixel camera, otherwise I can't get great results. Now, there is a correlation between camera quality, but just having a high megapixel camera doesn't mean you're going to get great results. Because if you think about it, in any project, what you want to do is you want to take the end goal or the end deliverable or whatever the customer is looking for and tie that back to the drone data and tie the drone data back to the camera. And so if you can achieve the results you want with a low megapixel camera or with a camera that has worse sensor quality, then that's fine. The project is actually measured by the success of the end customer, not by what camera was used. So I think this is again a big myth in the industry that a high megapixel camera will automatically yield better results. Again, what really matters is how the camera was used to actually achieve the deliverable that the client wanted. Another way to look at it is that, for example, if you've got a high megapixel camera, some people think that you can just fly further away from a target and get better results. Now, that's not necessarily just because of the high megapixel nature of the camera. That's because the sensor quality, the sensor width, the actual sensor size is better, which allows for more light to come into the camera and so many other things. So it's not just the megapixels alone. In fact, we did a whole case study on comparing a Mavic 2 Pro camera with a 50 megapixel camera on a Matrice drone. And we sort of checked out what the data sets will look like from different distances. We actually tried to simulate a scenario where you had the Mavic 2 Pro at a closer target to the building and the Matrice 300 with the 50 megapixel camera much further away, and we compared both data sets. And in the end, what happened is we realized that the data quality is better with the M300 and the 50 megapixel camera, but it's not because of the megapixels, it's because of the sensor quality. So once again, it's a myth that your megapixels are actually doing all the hard work, whereas in fact, it's the sensor quality. And as I mentioned before, what really matters is, have you got the right camera for the right job? If you don't need that quality, then it's completely okay to use a smaller megapixel camera, and that's fine. You have less headaches with the dataset sizes, and you've got less headaches with the client being able to view and work with the data. So another myth that needs to be busted. Right, so myth number 3, I need to get lots and lots of images to make a great map or model. Now, this couldn't be further from the truth. It is important to get the right amount of images. So if you have lacking images or not images in the right places, that will cause issues when it comes to creating maps and models. But you don't want to overdo it either. You don't want to have tens of thousands of images in a project that doesn't require that level of images. In fact, what's going to happen is you're going to increase your data set size, you're going to increase your processing times, you're going to increase all the headaches that comes with managing tens of thousands of images in one project. So what you really want to do is you want to get the right number of images that have the right overlap between each other and have the right coverage of the site or asset that you're trying to map or model. And if you've got that, then that number could be 500, could be 1,000 images, could be 2,000 images. That number doesn't really have to be tens of thousands of images. So that's something to bear in mind, that more images does not mean more data quality. It might just mean more headaches. So that's another myth to keep in mind. Myth number 4. So if I use RTK, that's going to help me avoid signal loss during flight. Again, not true. So RTK systems are real-time kinematic systems, and what they do is they correct for positioning error that drones' normal GPS systems suffer from. So they're more of a correction mechanism for positioning. They don't necessarily boost the signal, satellite signal to your particular drone. And if you're flying in areas where you're going to have issues with satellite signal or GPS signal, whether that's under a bridge or that's somewhat of an indoor environment, you're still going to have those issues with RTK systems. So RTK systems wouldn't necessarily improve the signal strength of your actual satellite connectivity. What it will do is that it would actually make the positioning of your drone better. So it would make sure that you are flying in a centimeter level precise manner, which again can contribute to absolute accuracy, which is what we talked about earlier. Right, so myth number 5 and the final myth for this particular video, that my takeoff location has nothing to do with data quality. I can take off from anywhere. Again, not true. So if you're doing, for example, a roof survey and you take off from the roof of the particular building as opposed to the ground, you must realize that actually when you do your overlap calculations, by default, your overlap calculations might be done relative to the ground as opposed to relative to the roof. And that can cause issues, because if you're taking off from the ground and you're actually capturing the roof, what you want to do is you want to do your calculations relative to the roof. And therefore, you need to have things like ground offsets to be able to help you with that particular workflow. And so your takeoff location does matter. And in fact, when it comes to DJI drones, most of your takeoff locations are actually relative to the takeoff point. So your altitude is very much a function of where you took off from. So really important to keep in mind that actually where you're taking off from can affect your data quality, even though those two things seem completely disjointed. Right. So we went through 5 myths that are very common in drone mapping, and hopefully when you come across these myths, you can join us in this revolution to bust these myths and make sure that people are actually capturing high quality drone data. We'll see you there in the next video for Knowledge Hub.